Hello everyone! I'm excited today to be filming a video that I've been wanting to make for this channel for quite some time. It required quite a bit of research as this is a topic that is very important to me. If you followed my channel, as you know, I do cover a lot of albums and music on this channel of artists that I love in particular. However, in this video, I wanted to be a little bit more objective in the scope of the narrative and context of what I'm talking about. So I wanted to make sure I was covering not just the artists that I pay more attention to, but looking at music history a little bit more in a broader kind of context, towards genres that I don't necessarily listen to. That is because today I am going to be talking about and ranking my personal, this is still my opinion, my personal favorite 30 album covers. These are the best 30 album covers of all time, in my opinion. I could argue and make arguments for them being the best of all time objectively, because a lot of these album covers are from artists that I've never actually listened to a single note of their music. But in looking at compilation lists and looking at what journalists have consistently ranked as some of the best album covers throughout the years, I've tried to include as much as I could. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of albums that I'll see covers for in the future, and I'll be like, darn it, I should have included that in this video. I could only include 30. I could have made this video super, super long. I will also include 10 honorable mentions. So it's really hard to rank them. I would say that, the ranking is kind of in a particular order, but don't take it too seriously. There were a couple album covers that I knew were going to be a top 5 before I made this video, but then the rest of the ranking, I wasn't really going by any specific criteria. I was just sort of thinking, how does this ranking feel like it sits the best for me? So without further ado, I will get into this. Now, I do want to just preface this video that this is about album artwork. So this is predominantly the front cover album art that you see from any sort of album that has been released. There's also, album art on the back covers and in the album booklets, which I will get into for certain albums, because I do think certain artists really invest a lot more time and energy into the actual artwork that they, use to present their album as the face of the album than others do. And I really appreciate, and I always have appreciated, an artist who really takes the time to understand and appreciate the brilliance and importance of a strong album cover. I think there are a lot of artists in the both non-mainstream and mainstream world that don't really take the album cover as seriously as they possibly could or should. The album cover, a lot like a book cover, is a really important thing that kind of draws you in to whether you actually want to invest any time in the album to begin with. I remember, I would always love to go through, CD stores, like when I go to Barnes & Noble. I know CD stores are a thing of the past these days, sadly, or vinyl or record stores. But I always love, especially when you look at vinyls, they're like, these larger sort of physical things that you can hold in your hands. And that's where the album art really, really shines, is when you look at it as a vinyl. The small little CD covers, it's a bit too minute. And the gloss, of the cover is sort of distorted by the reflections of the CD casings and everything. But when you look at it on a vinyl, like really, I think is in its truest element. And so, I really appreciate just going through, vinyl stores, and, I could never afford any artists on vinyl right now, and I don't have a record player, but, I really appreciate just going through and appreciating the album art as it's really meant to be appreciated in that form. And like I said, it's really about selling the music, but also representing the music the right way. And so that's a big criteria and factor that I put into. I know I am going to precursor this by saying that a lot of the albums I'm going to list here, I have not actually heard, or I've not heard the whole record for. But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate the album artwork, because this is, at the end of the day, just about the album art and kind of separating it from the music, even though the album art should very much be tied to the music itself. The album art should represent the actual ambiance and character of the music that is within. And good album artwork does that in a very sort of meaningful, intriguing, artistically, aesthetically pleasing, and tasteful way. And aesthetics do come into this a lot. So a lot of it's my taste. The one thing I do want to just also say is this is not the most iconic album covers of history video. That would be an entirely separate video. Although there is some overlap, if I were to make a video talking about the most historically iconic album covers, then I would be including a lot more album covers that are not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing, but album covers that set trends for the music industry. Think of Michael Jackson's album covers, or think of the Abbey Road album cover, for example. These are iconic album covers that everyone knows the imagery for, that sort of represented a movement or something in culture that was extremely important. And aesthetic taste aside, and artistic decisions aside, that is its sort of own thing. So I'm not going to necessarily be including a lot of iconic album covers, although several of them will make it into this list, because there are some iconic album covers that I do think are actually really tastefully created. But there are some that I think are more important in the cultural context than they are in terms of like the objective sort of or subjective artistic context. For the music itself. So I just wanted to make that disclaimer. Without much further ado, let me get into my number 30 pick. I decided to put at number 30 an album cover that is very divisive. A lot of people either love it or hate it. MIA's album covers have always been known to be very flashy, very pop art, very graphic. And she utilizes her art skills, her art school past to create herself and design these album covers that do feel a little bit like a overload of color and texture, but she does that on purpose. If you listen to her music, it is extremely in your face, and it is full of texture and full of color and full of sort of an urgency that I think her album art accurately portrays. The album art for Kala, which was her second studio album released in August of 2007, I decided was one of her most noteworthy album covers. It's critically acclaimed to be pretty iconic. The imagery of her amongst all of this kind of graphic pop art, and I just think it represents the character and the ambiance of the record very well. At number 29, we have the album cover for the Kendrick Lamar album To Pimp a Butterfly, which was released in March of 2015. Now, normally I find album covers that have a lot going on in them with tons of different characters. Think of like the Sgt. Pepper's and the Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover by the Beatles, for example. They tend to be a little too much in one frame for my liking, so even though they're iconic, I don't necessarily find them aesthetically pleasing. However, the monochromatic Polaroid texture of this very striking image of a cohort of Black men and women posing on the White House lawn with Kendrick Lamar himself featured in amongst the crowd, really draws the eye into the image without everyone feeling like, without it feeling overwhelming. It actually has a very well composed foreground and background. The faces are not all the same size, so it helps lead you into the image without feeling like it was cut and paste or it's overwhelming on the eyes. The facial expressions are also unique and carry so much emotion. And as anyone is familiar with Kendrick Lamar's music, there is a very strong political undertone to this record, and the album art is definitely a testament to the Black Power movement, to the social injustices that we face today, particularly for the Black community, with police brutality, reparations, discrimination in all forms, systemically. And so all of these characters and all of their expressions all tie into the thematic psyche of this record. And I think it is a wonderful documentation of the energy that this album is trying to imbue. At number 28, we have the album Unmapped by Wisconsin indie rock band Volcano Choir. This album was released in September of 2009. I don't know anything about this band or this album, but in doing my research, it was one of the album covers that stood out to me for its striking, visceral, cinematic essence, with the gorgeous lone yellow-clothed figure in a snowy landscape, which evokes tons of different emotional responses. I always will be a sucker for well-photographed cloth and drapery, and I will always be a sucker for really beautiful landscape imagery that is very emotional and it's in the way it's photographed. So this album art is checking all of those boxes for me. At number 27, we have the album cover for Jeffrey, an album by rapper Young Thug. This is actually a mixtape cover, but it was still released kind of like as an album. It was released in August of 2016. Um, as Young Thug is one of the very few prominently queer LGBT rappers in the very heteronormative male hip hop music scene, the way he is introducing this side of himself through the album art, which is very expressive, very feminine, very editorial, is a very kind of is a celebration of Black femininity, a Black queer femininity, which is something that we don't see enough of in the hip hop scene. And so the album cover does a brilliant job of introducing that side of him in a way that is tasteful and not over the top and shocking, but almost more elegant and graceful and highly fashionable and stylized. At number 26, we have the album cover for the album Horses by Patti Smith. Released in November of 1975, this album cover features Patti Smith looking stoically at the camera in a pose that has so many layers to it. You could read it as a confident pose, but also as a very feminine and delicate one. And the simplicity, as I said, about the monochromatic contrast between the outfit she is wearing, the overall straps, the very elegantly shoulder draped coat, present themselves in such a aesthetically pleasing manner to invite you into the record. This album cover was shot by the acclaimed American photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, who was a close friend of Smith. At number 25, we have the cover for the album The Division Bell by English rock band Pink Floyd, released in March of 1994. Pink Floyd has an incredible repertoire of album covers. We all know the iconic 70s album cover, The Dark Side of the Moon. I was originally going to include that album cover in this list, but upon looking at their other album covers and upon realizing that I do think they fall more into, a lot of the times, the iconic category rather than the artistically best album covers of all time. I think if you looked at that prism image today, if any band were to put out that album cover today, I don't think it would be quite as impactful or interesting as what they did when they did it first in the 70s. So that's why I would include it more in the iconic category rather than necessarily in the top 30 category. For me, the best Pink Floyd album cover is a later album of theirs called The Division Bell, which features a painting by Storm Thorgerson. The meaning behind the image has to this day remained a mystery, as Pink Floyd is one of those enigmatic rock groups who don't really like to give too much of the picture away. The meaning of the album title has been revealed to allude to the bell that is used during parliamentary sessions in England. Very abstract sculptural image that we see on this cover is left up to the interpretation of the viewer. There are many iconic representations of this sculpture found all over the world, and I have always loved abstract sculpture, and so seeing that utilized on an album cover is brilliant. The eerie image of two faces and what they appear to be devouring between them in a landscape evokes Salvador Dali imagery in the mind. So the surrealism is very strong. This album came out not long after the fall of the Soviet Union. And themes of this record involve communication and talking to once separate entities to try and understand the complexities of life. And so the idea and title of The Division Bell and the idea of these two figureheads speaking to one another for the first time was a theme that was employed in the representation of this album cover. At number 24, we have the album cover for the record The World is a Beautiful Place by American indie rock band Harmlessness. This album was released in September of 2015. This is an album cover that shows a specific moment captured in motion, full of drama and full of esoteric wonder of a figure, presumably a woman, running away from a man in a mask. Imagery that can evoke lots of sort of childhood fears of what might lie in the forests, the unknown, of also the sort of feminist angle of what monsters may lie in masculinity that women constantly have to run away from and avoid. The layers are myriad on this very haunting and ethereal snapshot that we get of this moment captured in what would normally be a very mundane setting. At number 23, we have the iconic album cover for the Beatles' seventh studio album, Revolver, released in August of 1966. This is an album cover that I would definitely include in both categories of iconic and tasteful aesthetic. This album cover was one of the first to feature all of the band members sort of in different dimensionalities, facing different directions, looking in different ways to sort of represent the character of the band. And since that time, you have seen many groups from ABBA to One Republic today copy this type of band photo for an album cover. But what makes this album cover, I think, stand out the most is, of course, the illustrative nature of the imagery. This is one of their early psychedelic records, and so the imagery we see, which shows them in a very sort of whimsical, illustrative way, it was designed by Klaus Vormann, who does a lot of spacey drawings. He then combined the drawings that he made of the band with collages of black and white photos of the different members of the Beatles, and collaged them together in amongst the sort of center space, would have been the negative space. So you've got a mix of small scale and large scale, and the interweaving of these photographs with these very sort of loose drawings that are very expressive in their simplicity, create a sort of narrative of confusion and whimsicality at the same time, that play with the eye and weave the eye through the image beautifully. And I think there is something to be said about the understated element to it. Like I said, the Beatles are known for some of their more colorful album covers. Think The Yellow Submarine or Sgt. Pepper's. And so them going black and white, but still having so much rich texture and detail in the image, I think was a nice sort of break from the pace. At number 22, we have the cover for Icelandic artist Bjork's sixth studio album, Volta, which was released in May of 2007. This is widely considered to be one of Bjork's stranger album covers, and it has been routinely critically acclaimed by many publications as one of the best album covers of the last 15 to 20 years. For its exuberant bright colors, for its oddball costuming, and at the same time, what would consider a very hilarious image, what presumes to be these sort of like chicken legs on what looks a little bit like a tomato, has turned into something that is so artful and serious in only a way that Bjork can conjure it to be. I actually saw a replica of this costume or vessel that she inhabits in this album cover when I saw her MoMA retrospective back in 2015. I think this cover works so strongly because of the electric red background, which really energizes the space around what would otherwise feel like is a very kind of frivolous and pointless image. The red space that it inhabits gives it a sense of place and a sense of cohesion that brilliantly allows the image to pop out at you. It's very explosive. And if you listen to this record, that is definitely a theme that comes through. The white outline is imperative, as it definitely helps the colors within the costume pop out at you and definitely gives it that attitude to stand out instead of blend in. This cover was shot by British fashion photographer Nick Knight, and the piece itself was created by German fashion designer Bernard Wilhelm. At number 21, we have the shocking and controversial album cover from the American rock band The Strokes with their album Is This It?, released in July of 2001. There's actually two covers to this record, understandably, because the first album cover, particularly for its time, caused quite a bit of controversy as it shows a big woman's behind in a very sort of BDSM image. It's actually not that explicit, but the undertone of sexuality is very prevalent. If you strip that away, if you look at the image itself, it is a brilliant photograph. The composition is so artfully considered. And the shapes that are formed, it's the best and most brilliant example of a photograph of something that zoomed in to turn something that is very representational into an abstract form. And at the same time, you can still recognize what it is to be portraying. And the fact that it is cropped in the way that it is gives it particular emphasis on a specific energy that I think is quite sexual and provocative, but at the same time, mysterious. This album cover, although controversial, has been regarded by critics as one of the most iconic and eclectic album covers of all time. At number 20, we have the very romantic and Arcadian abstract realist imagery for the cover of French artist Sebastien Julia with his album Evenfall, released in May of 2009. A combination of a collage of photographs that would not normally seem to go together, but fit together like a perfect jigsaw puzzle in bringing about such vivid, picturesque, and romanticist imagery that evokes whimsy, introspection, melancholy. And so all of the colors are artfully considered. We've got a lot of these cooler tones mixed with the bright popping yellows and orange, which complement each other beautifully. And the light and the way it dances around the imagery with the reflection of the ripples in the water and the Degas like ballet dancers mixed with that beautiful headscarf of that lackadaisical young child figure, just it gives the eye so much to feast upon in such a beautiful musical way that I think illustrates the very sort of misty, sort of esoteric alternative music that Sebastien creates. Okay, so like it or not, unfortunately, I cannot make a best album covers video without mentioning the iconic but controversial American rapper Kanye West, particularly his fifth studio album titled My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, released in November of 2010. This is probably one of his most experimental album cover efforts, in that he employed artist George Condo, who created 5 different covers that can be used as the album cover itself, framed in gold outline against a very red background. The imagery ranges from quite simplistic to quite surrealist to very BDSM provocative. And in fact, one of the covers was actually banned in the United States and because it was too explicit, and so has been pixelated in lots of publications. And knowing Kanye, he probably thinks of himself as somewhat of a cultural martyr for taking that hit. He likes to push the boundaries. Say what you want about Kanye, but some of the utter brilliance of not only the music, but the visuals that he created, particularly for this album, which was a visual album, was very Black Swan, if you consider the sort of like twisted dark ballerina aesthetic. But it was also very artistically considered. And in so many of the imagery, you can see references to surrealism, but also to cubism, to the art of Picasso. At number 18, we have the iconic cover for the English rock band Black Sabbath with their album of the same title, released in February of 1970. This album is widely considered to be one of the first heavy metal records, and so this album cover is widely known amongst heavy metal enthusiasts as being not only intriguing and haunting, but also iconic for that very reason. And as someone who has not set foot into that world of that genre, I can appreciate, however, the haunting, mysterious imagery of this figure in black set against a English country house or an autumn scene. This album cover depicts the Maple Durham watermill, which is on the Thames River in Oxfordshire in England. There are many speculations amongst fans that this woman was not actually there when the image was taken of this mill in Oxfordshire, and that she only appeared once the film was being developed. Say what you would like about that interesting rumor, but the way that she fits into the false color eerie sort of imagery behind her does make it feel like as though she's appeared out of thin air herself. And her very sort of simplistic, ghostly black figure will definitely make people think of death itself in a way that is so iconic and so haunting that I cannot stop thinking about the sheer brilliance of a cover that is so wrapped around its own story and its own mystery that really keeps the viewer wanting to look at it, even though a part of them says they probably shouldn't. At number 17, we have the psychedelic, trippy, colorful album cover for American pop star Kesha with her album Rainbow, released in August of 2017. Kesha returned to the music industry in a big and psychedelic way with an album about spaceships, about an introspective yearning to find your people and to feel more at peace with your own self and your own struggles that you've gone through and hardship, and decided to celebrate that UFO, psychedelic Salvador Dali imagery with the most perplexing album we've seen in contemporary pop culture, I think, in quite some time. The album artwork was designed and created by Robert Beatty, Brian Rodinger, and Olivia B. The geometric elements of the angles of everything coming to a center point, and Kesha standing naked, facing away from us, projecting this idea of traveling or continuing to another point far in the horizon, as this one dripping eyeball in the corner sort of watches it eerily, creates a somewhat unsettling, but honestly, at the end of the day, still very pleasing image to feast the eyes upon. At number 16, we have the album cover for an album titled Rome by artists Tom Hobden and Elliot James, released in June of 2017. This image, although very simple, is so complex in its beautiful textures and its abstract realism that captured brilliantly by the photographer who captured these images of what appear to be sticks forming fences, a lot of what you would see like at the beach by the dunes, creating a wonderful undulating pattern against either what would be snow or could be sand, that, as I said, are full of such movement and rhythm for such a still and stark black and white image, and showcase such poetic, beautiful abstract landscape for the eyes that you can just get lost in with its patterns of light and dark reflecting back upon each other in interesting patterns. So one of the more eye-catching and photographically tasteful album covers that I have ever seen, for sure. At number 15, we have the fantasy-laden imagery of the Norwegian electronic producer Amethystium's fourth studio album, Isabliss, which was released in June of 2008, depicting a twisting tree trunk disappearing up into a beautifully textured, fluffy cloud. If you look at the album artwork that is within the album booklets for that CD packaging itself, we get such beautiful, haunting black and white imagery of what I would consider very elven imagery that is once moody and melancholic, but airy and light with delicate curves and intricate tendrils. That sort of aesthetic and is all represented beautifully in the imagery for this very sort of wistful and fantasy electronic record that at the same time is quite moody and weighted. The abstract imagery of a cloud being the rooftop, being the treetops of a tree. I mean, that's just brilliant right there. The cover was designed by Brian Son, and the imagery was created by artist Marcela Bolivar. Okay, so number 14, we have an album cover that everyone under the sun is familiar with, and one of the few album covers that I would say definitely falls under that classic, iconic album cover category, but as well as the tasteful, aesthetically pleasing album artwork category. Nirvana's iconic 1991 album, Nevermind, with that provocative, well-known imagery of the baby floating in the pool chasing after that dollar bill on the fishhook. We have seen this album cover represented in pop culture throughout the 25 years since this album was released. And so because of that in itself, it has become a staple in pop culture. But if you dissect that away, this album cover is still sheer brilliance in giving you a loaded image, symbolism for the band. The idea of a dollar bill on a fishhook just out of reach, and a baby, the idea of innocence being swallowed up by mass consumerism and materialism, is something that Kurt Cobain was definitely trying to portray at the forefront of this album, which carried a strong nihilistic, irreverent punk rock aesthetic that really wanted to break the status quo and symbolizes what punk really was for the 90s and at that time. At number 13, we have the album cover for the new age electronic wizard that is Enigma, or Michael Cretu, with his 8th studio album, The Fall of a Rebel Angel, which was released in November of 2016. This is a painting by a French artist named Wolfgang Beltracchi, and it depicts an image of a fallen angel that he used in one of his earlier paintings, that Enigma's creator, Michael Cretu, saw in his studio in Paris and said, I need that on my album cover. He employed Wolfgang to paint imagery for every single song, all 10 songs on this beautiful esoteric record. And the imagery is sort of very Da Vinci-esque in the idea of the fallen angel and the Vitruvian man, with the idealized male form being sort of the idea of the symbol of angels mixed with the sort of chaotic, colorful imagery that is depicting the fall from heaven, or the fall of man, which is an iconic biblical centerpiece. And it references the iconic Gustave Doré etchings that are also titled The Fall of a Rebel Angel. Sheer emotion and agony that is shown in this twisting form of this angel who has fallen from heaven, has been cast out, is so brilliantly portrayed in this album art. And so it captures the religiosity, but at the same time, the sort of shocking and provocative imagery that Enigma is known for, with its highly spiritualized, esoteric music, which I highly recommend listening to. At number 12, we have the acclaimed album art for New Zealand artist Lorde's second studio album titled Melodrama, released in June of 2017. Most people will be familiar with this beautiful, cooler color-toned portrait of the singer herself, with a depressive look in her eyes as she lays in bed. The expressive brushstrokes are full of emotion, and the color choices are extremely crepuscular and moody to evoke the idea of what this title is trying to get at, which is intense internal melancholy and emotional struggle. This is a painting by Brooklyn-based artist Sam McInnes, who painted the iconic portrait of Lorde. At number 11, we have one of the probably more puzzling and wacky album covers that I have seen, for sure, but yet at the same time that is still so entrancing and captivating. We have the cover for The Future Sound of London, the electronic British alternative group, with their album Life Forms, which was released in May of 1994. Here we see a young girl holding out what appears to be some form of jelly or some kind of biological creature that is not exactly identifiable, but looks like a sea anemone, against what looks like a stark canyon background. None of the images make any sense to the viewer, and if you look at Future Sound of London's other album covers, or even some of the other artwork that was released as a part of the imagery for this album, Life Forms, you will be left scratching your head, as we've got a lot of these sort of CGI, computer-generated, amorphous biological forms interconnecting and connecting with human figures who are mysteriously placed in the covers without much context, against backgrounds that are at the same time very sort of recognizable, but also very dystopian and extraterrestrial. This is all, of course, much of the aesthetic of the enigmatic energy that is Future Sound of London's music. I remember when I first saw this album cover and I listened to this album, I spent so much time digging into the meaning and trying to understand and piece together what some of this imagery might mean. But at the end of the day, you're just going to reach a dead end because they purposely do this to evoke, this sort of psychedelia that is not really meant to be explained, at least not sober, possibly. And so a lot of people may consider their album covers to be the results of really, really strong drug trips. But even sober, I can appreciate the very haunting, appealing energy that is coming from this Chinese girl who was used as the model for these photographs, uh, opening her arms to you in front of you, an invitation to present this being to you. And the album is called Life Forms. In the song titles and in the ambient electronic sounds, which, by the way, this is an ambient electronic album, so I do want to cover this album on my channel at some point because it's an album I really have a lot to say about in terms of the music. We get a lot of music that evokes imagery of organic biological forms. And so the idea of representing that in a very sort of abstract way as a symbol for something that could be very spiritual, that could be very physical, when we're talking about something that is very scientific, that is very much inside of us, is a beautiful way of blending and bringing the two together, the esoteric and the physical of, the scientific. I could speak for hours about how much this imagery puzzles and intrigues me, but at the end of the day, it's really just something where a picture speaks 1,000 words, and if you listen to the music, I think it'll all sort of make sense to you in a very kind of unconventional way. Now, before I get to my top 10, I mentioned there were some honorable mentions I wanted to cover, so I'm just going to mention them really quick. Album covers that I also thought were quite stellar, but didn't quite make it onto the list of the top 30 for me, although it was really hard to choose. So the following album covers are my honorable mentions. Awaken My Love by Childish Gambino. Everyone Afraid to Be Forgotten by Yona Lee. Vespertine by Bjork. A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. LP1 by FKA Twigs. True Blue by Madonna. The Divine Feminine by Mac Miller. Enema of the State by Blink 182. Brand New Eyes by Paramore. And 'Cause I Love You by Lizzo. Okay, so at number 10, we have the surprisingly intricate cover that we get from American pop artist Rihanna's 8th studio album, Anti. I don't think any of us were expecting a Rihanna album to be so loaded with artistic, aesthetic meaning and layers. But the piece that we get for that album, which is, I think, much stronger than the actual album itself, I have to say, is something quite museum-worthy. It features an image of Rihanna as a young child with a crown over her eyes, holding a red balloon with this red paint covering half of the imagery. There's also, in the actual physical piece that was created, Braille that is etched into the actual canvas. The artist behind this iconic image is Israeli artist Roy Nakum. The actual cover art is titled If They Let Us Part 1, and it is part of the artist's Blind series, which has a lot to do with inner and outer vision related to the viewer. And there's always these corresponding messages that are layered over the image in Braille. The fact that Rihanna chose this as her album cover to make this collaboration with the image of her was definitely a power move for Rihanna, in which she was basically saying, look, I can help my music be aided by the beautiful symbiotic relationship that is strong album artwork, which is something that up until that point very much just been about that, sexy photo shoot. But for once, Rihanna takes that step back and douses the imagery with such rich aesthetic texture and symbolism that creates a lasting, haunting image that the viewer cannot forget easily. At number 9, we have the cover for All My Demons Greeting Me as a Friend by Norwegian pop artist Aurora, which was released in March of 2016. This is an album cover that is criminally underrated by publications who are constantly looking to cite the top 10 album covers of the year. I have not seen anyone give any love to this beautifully photographed and shot album cover of Aurora wrapped up in what appears to be silken threads to make herself into the shape and body of a moth, suspended in animation. The very sort of children's fairy tale element that is employed with beautiful imagery that she employs in this photo shoot fits so beautifully with her childlike and innocent storytelling that she creates on these wonderful, this beautiful music she puts out on this record. With the nice little head tilt, which helps to show that she's in her own space and she's not aware of the camera that is on her. So it makes her look a bit more like an artifact or a taxidermy than it does a actual photo shoot. At number 8, we have the, as ever, uniquely weird and alien album artwork for Bjork's 9th studio album, Utopia, released in November of 2017. Bjork's album covers are always iconic, and this one is definitely stepping up to that plate. The makeup was done by a phenomenal makeup artist named Is He Hungry. The album cover, shot by Jesse Conda, shows Bjork as the unique character that she is portraying for this record, as she does for all of her albums. They all are about a different persona coming forth, or a different creature that she is channeling. And so with this album, we are getting the element of flutes, which is symbolized by the 2 holes that are placed into her throat, as well as the birds of paradise coloring that is used as the makeup on her face, with the very sort of erotic plant-like imagery that evokes that of an orchid, which we see as part of the body adornment for her face. And the poofy electric blue hair wig, along with the slimy, glossamer textured bodice that surrounds her, presents itself confidently and provocatively to the viewer in an unapologetic gaze, with her very bird-like eyes that are distorted by the contacts she is wearing, tying in all of these different creatures into one form, as only the ever polymorphous, enigmatic character that Bjork could ever do. At number 7, we have the album cover for the compilation album by Grace Jones titled Island Life, released in December of 1985. Grace turns herself into what appears to be a wax figure posed against a blue background, holding a microphone while doing an exotic stretch, which elongates the shape and form of her body. It is a brilliant display of body as sculpture, is a wonderful and unique way of displaying Black femininity in a form that is at once athletic but nuanced and artistic. One of the amazing things is that this was a perfect example of a pre-digital collage made by the art director of this photo shoot, Jean-Paul Goude, who stitched together the original photo of Grace, who is, otherwise in a position of stretch that I think is very hard to reach, especially for someone who's not an Olympic athlete. And he then collaged and stitched her to be in a more elongated and possible form against the background, which was a marvelous act of genius for the pre-digital era of photographic collage. So at number 6, we have another Bjork album cover. This is the cover for her 3rd acclaimed studio record, Homogenic, released in September of 1997. If you've watched my Homogenic album review, I talked about why I think this album cover is so iconic and her best album cover to date. It is a photo shoot that transfigures her for the first time into a unique character, one that she continues to play with subsequent albums, with unique transfigurations, with haute couture and different assemblages of cultural and biological appendages. There is a lot of, as I said, cultural applications that are disparate, that are put together into creating this image. The kimono that she is wearing is distinctly Japanese. However, the hair that she is wearing is distinctly culturally Chinese hairstyle, where the neck rings is a distinctly African cultural adornment. All of these elements are to give off of an austerity, an authority, a regality. It's very feminine. And this album is all about that regality and that authority. It's that album that Bjork really wanted to make to sort of blast from the mountaintops. These distinct costume choices reflect to my understanding, an adornment of universal femininity that was always considered to be more refined and quiet and delicate, but using that to symbolize a more powerful image that represents sort of as an empress or a queen with a very confrontational stare. The dress in the cover was designed by the acclaimed late Alexander McQueen. Okay, so at number 5, we have the exquisitely psychedelic album cover for Australian artist Taemin Paula's third studio album titled Currents, released in July of 2015. The imagery created by a computer shows a silver ball being pulled along a field of straight lines that are disrupted by its movement to create a very oddly satisfying image, which is very synesthetic in quality. And it's definitely meant to play with the mind and the way the eye perceives line, repetitive pattern, and color and texture. This fits beautifully with their whole psychedelic rock, synth pop, neo-psychedelia genre of music to trip out the brain and perplex the viewer. The artist who created this image was Robert Beatty. An underlying theme of disruption is prevalent when you see this ball kind of rippling through what was before it such a regimented framework of repetition. So at number 4, we have an extremely emotional photographic image that is the album cover for the band Amen-Ra's album titled Mass 6, featuring what presumably is a tired or possibly dead swan languishing against a monochrome surface. This imagery is immediately compelling for its photographic elegance and also for the way the light captures the heaviness of this defeated animal, which is once so regal and graceful with its beautiful wings and feathers and streamlined form, defeatedly arched across a harsh black surface, which gives off a feeling of extreme exhaustion and defeat in the most elegant and tragically beautiful ways possible that I have ever seen depicted in a photograph. And so for this alone, I have not heard a note of this group's music, but I get such an emotional appeal from just staring at this arresting image that I can't help but want to pick up the CD and actually listen to its contents. This is what really appealing, strong visual album covers do to you. They make you want to look further within. They puzzle you, they intrigue you, and they immediately grab you with an emotional appeal. And so for me, this was definitely going to be a top 5 from the minute I saw it, even though I only recently discovered it from doing some research on different album covers from groups I'd not heard of. Looking at this image, I'm very interested in listening to what this image might sound like, if that makes any sense. At number 3, we have Hijira by Joni Mitchell, released in October of 1976, with this timeless image of her against a horizon line of a road leading into the distance, with a nice, beautiful, snowy forest sort of floating just back in the background. This is an image that would not work so well if it wasn't in black and white, and I think that the textures that come through from seeing the actual roadway disappear into the fabric of her own clothing, that is this own shape that forms itself abstractly because of the contrasts against the white background. Everything plays off of each other so brilliantly in the ways that things are layered on top of one another. But at the same time, it doesn't feel as though it was overshot or, things were too layered to make something too complex. It is at the same time simple and direct and full of layer and texture. And I love the shot of her with the hand, very Anna Leibovitz style photograph of her with raised hand, confidently eschewing the sort of essence and energy that I think that this album is full of. This album was, of course, conceived basically from one long road trip by car from Maine all the way to Los Angeles. And so the energy of a journey across vast landscapes is transferred through the photographic imagery that we see displayed here. At number 2, we have The Memory of Trees by Irish musician Enya, released in December of 1995. For those who follow my channel, it's probably not much of a surprise that this album is nearing the top of my list. And it was a very close shot for number 1 for me, as this is one of the most emotionally stirring album covers that I have ever seen. The imagery of Enya draped in this very rich velvet costume, sitting atop a golden throne with a soft power behind her stance, evokes an exotic mysticism that feels very ancient and almost Egyptian. The imagery, though, is not Enya's own. This was completely an inspirational photo shoot from the iconic painting by Maxfield Parrish titled The Young King of the Black Isles from 1906. This was one of the images he created for his Arabian Nights illustrations. And so Enya and her photographic team took the exact same costuming and background and recreated it in such a faithful but yet distinctly Enya way by just adding her own logo to the sphere that is represented above her and just changing the pose slightly by raising her head to face the viewer to make this her own statement. And although some people may think it is a direct copy of that original, as it is extremely similar in that they're exactly the same imagery, she is just recreating it, there is nothing wrong with looking to an artist who has inspired you in the past. Enya has taken lots of inspiration from Maxfield Parrish for her visuals and her videos, to celebrate that and to use it to add more layers and more meaning to an image that is already so full of mystery and meaning to begin with. And so Enya is just continuing that legacy here. And I love seeing artists use that sort of historical lens to recontextualize and remystify older works by adding their own magic to them, as this is a very magical record in itself. And so I will forever be captivated by this gorgeous photo shoot. And at number 1, you know, it's funny, I talk about Curly being one of my favorite artists, but, you know, it's not often that her songs necessarily top any sort of list of mine. But her debut record titled Love Is Dead, which was released in July of 2008, the album cover for this record will forever be probably the one album cover I've seen so far in my life that I just could not turn away from. From the instant you look at it, you are intrigued by the weird, cartoonish, gothic fairy tale that is carried through, not to mention the electric, melancholic blue colors that seep through the image. This was designed by a Lithuanian illustrator named Natalie Shao, who has made tons of very sort of Alice in Wonderland, Tim Burton, Coraline style kind of gothic Lolita imagery that is very much the aesthetic of Curly's Love Is Dead album. So it was a perfect blend for the two to collaborate. And the back cover, the imagery that was created for the website when this album was released, that was revolving around this figure of Curly represented as this sort of porcelain doll, was just absolutely brilliant and breathtaking to me. Head is enlarged against the rest of her body to distort the reality of the image, helps to really take you into the fantasy of it instead of making it feel too serious, because it is so cartoonish and it is so stylized, but in such an emotional and impactful way that you don't often find from typical cartoons that you might see. The inviting imagery that is given to us in this highly detailed album art that Curly is channeling for this record, which is this broken, innocent, young, punk doll figure who is very broken inside, who is celebrating the sort of the darker, moodier uh, color tones of like heavy blues and the night sky and ravens and the kind of gothic Eastern European fairy tale. And so, what else can I really say? This is just very beautifully stylized, very beautifully composed, and an album cover that, like I said, if I saw in a record store, I could not turn away from. I could not physically stop myself from picking up, wanting to look at the back, wanting to listen to what's inside, because it just causes that reaction. Like I said, that visceral reaction within me, that maybe I see myself in something in the cover, or there's something just so visually appealing about the way it was composed that you can't help but think that the artist behind it is going to mirror that energy. And they do very well with most of these albums I've mentioned. Like I said, I have only listened to about half of these albums that I've just mentioned. And I definitely would like to eventually get through and listen to the contents of some of these jaw-droppingly beautiful album covers that I have just discussed in this video. But we'll see when that might happen. But all of them are definitely making me want to pick up the record and see what's inside. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's really hard for me to describe some of the things I've been feeling when describing some of these covers, so I hope I did a good job. Please, please, in the comments, let me know of other album covers that you love. What are your top 10 favorite album covers that have always stuck with you and will for the rest of your life? Because I have missed a ton, and I definitely would be interested to learn more about, different artists and some of the amazing visual arts that they put forward to celebrate and to represent their art. Because at the end of the day, I am a 2D visual artist, and so the album cover is always going to speak loads for me, maybe more than most people tend to give it credit for. And I don't want to see the album cover become a lost art. I want to see the album cover still be celebrated, even in the era of streaming, the era of digital sales. I don't want to see the artistry behind a good album cover disappear entirely. And so I hope that we still continue to see artists push the boundaries with what an album cover can represent and what an album cover can be, by exploring their own artistry and their own music in that 2D representation of it. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely, blessed day. Peace, love, and light. Bye.